Buenas tardes. ¿Ya? A la sala de espera. Muy bien. 13 personas. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos los que nos escuchan, que están aquí para atender la conferencia del doctor Gagarin, Michael Gagarin, de la Universidad de Texas, en Austin. El doctor Gagarin es profesor de esa universidad y actualmente ya es un emérito. Es director, ha sido, presidente de la American Philological Association, que ahora se llama Society for Classical Studies, y ha sido también presidente de la Classical Association of the Midwest and South. El doctor Gagarin tiene 26 libros publicados e igualmente tiene libros como editor y ha sido editor de series, sobre todo, sus temas trabaja también retórica, literatura, filosofía e historia, pero su tema principal, como todos ustedes saben, pues es el derecho griego. Es un experto en derecho griego y tiene libros tan importantes como, por ejemplo, Democratic Law in Classical Athens, y uno que es clásico ya, que es Early Greek Law, entre otros trabajos. También, pues quienes hemos seguido un poco su trayectoria, pues hemos visto cómo se ha enfrascado en polémicas sobre temas de derecho griego muy, muy específicos, con otros autores en interesantes polémicas, como digo, en revistas especializadas. Como profesor, la referencia de sus alumnos es que es un verdadero experto en su tema y que es muy afable con los alumnos también. Yo no le quito más tiempo al doctor Gagarin y le cedo la palabra. Su conferencia está grabada, pero él está presente escuchándonos. Muchas gracias.
Begin by confessing that this is the first time I have ever given a talk using PowerPoint. And because of this, I decided that I would pre-record the entire talk in order to make certain that nothing would go wrong. And I also want to say there is a handout that I hope it has been made available to you for downloading it. It contains all of the full texts of all the agreements that I'm going to be talking about. I also want to say they're noon. So with that, here goes. For the last 15 years, my colleague Paula Perlman and I have been studying the legal texts inscribed on stone on the island of Crete. We have completed one volume of texts covering from 650 to 400 BCE, and we are now at work on texts from about 400 BCE to 50
So with
BCE.
that, here goes.
One of the big differences between these two periods is that
Whereas
for the last
almost
15
all
years,
surviving
my colleague Paula
inscriptions from
Perlman
the
and
earlier
I
period
have been
are
laws, that is, statutes. In the later period, many other kinds of texts were inscribed. Especially common are agreements or treaties between two
We are now
or
at
more
work
cities.
on texts
from about 400
parts of some 50
BCE
agreements
to
between
50
two
Cretan
that,
polis
here
survive
goes.
from post.
One
One of the big differences between these two periods,
plus another
is
22
that
between
whereas
the last
almost
15
all
years,
surviving
non-Cretan
inscriptions
polis
from
and
an earlier
king
period
have been
are
laws,
and an additional 5 between a Cretan polis and another polis whose name does not survive. Most of these agreements are at least partly fragmentary, but what survives provides us with enough evidence to draw some interesting conclusions about language and power. Now, as background, I will refer to the period in question, that is 400 to 50 BCE, as post-classical Crete, not Hellenistic Crete. The reason being, unlike any other part of the Greek world, Crete never had a Hellenistic period. Neither Alexander nor any of his successors ever tried to conquer Crete. We can mark the end of this period in Crete by the Roman conquest of the island in 67 BCE, but for the beginning of the period, the most important date in Crete is around 400 BCE, when Cretan polis stopped using their individual epicoric alphabets and dialects and switched instead to the common Ionic alphabet and a common form of Doric. This development signaled two important changes: a growing sense of unity among the 50 or so polis on the island, and a sense of belonging to the larger Greek world. And as we shall see, agreements also played an important role in fostering both these feelings. And they also helped Cretan cities affirm their independence, both from one another and from all the other polis and powers in the Greek world. Unlike the polis on the island of Rhodes, which had joined together into a political unit, Cretan polis remained politically independent, even during those brief periods when they formed a loose federation which they called the koinon. Now, to illustrate and support these general observations, I will examine the language of several different agreements. I begin with agreements between a Cretan polis and a non-Cretan polis or power. These not only confirm the independence of the Cretan polis, but also asserted that the Cretan polis were equal partners with the other polis and powers of the Greek world, even when the actual military strength of any individual Cretan polis was far less than that of these other polis and powers. So I will give 4 examples of this. First, this is handout 1. This is an agreement between the Oreoi, or mountain people, a loose association of 5 or 6 very small polis in the mountains of southwest Crete, and Magas, king of Cyrenaica, who was a half-brother of Ptolemy II. The power of the Oreoi at this time was insignificant compared to that of the large African province of Cyrene. All that survives of this agreement is an oath, which I have omitted, and a short section towards the end, which I put up on the slide. This provides that Magas and the Oreoi, and I quote now, would have the same friend and enemy, and if anyone should invade Magas's territory, the Oreoi would send aid, and in the same way, if anyone should invade the territory of the Oreoi, Magas would send aid. Now this language asserts an identical commitment from both parties to assist the other in case of need. But in reality, both commitments are almost meaningless. On the one hand, it is highly unlikely that anyone would have wanted to invade the territory of these tiny mountain poleis. And on the other hand, if anyone were to invade Cyrenaica, the amount of aid that the Oreoi might provide would be utterly negligible next to Magas's own forces. But the agreement allows the Oreoi to claim an exact equality with an important Greek power, regardless of the reality. Now, the other agreements are similar. On the second on your handout is an agreement between Hierapytna on the southeast coast of Crete and the island of Rhodes. Rhodes at this time was one of the mightiest sea powers in the Greek world, far more powerful than Hierapytna, and it clearly was the driving force behind this agreement. The agreement begins in lines 7 to 12 by obliging the Hierapytnians to work together with the Rhodians and make available to them their city and harbors and naval bases. There is no equivalent obligation for the Rhodians. But the next clause, it's lines 12 to 15, obliges the Hierapytnians to come to the aid of the Rhodians if anyone should attack Rhodes. And this obligation is reciprocated later in lines 58 to 66, though not in the exact same words. There are also other obligations imposed on the Hierapytnians, such as to help Rhodes recruit mercenaries and combat piracy, and some, though not all of these, of the same obligations are imposed on the Rhodians. So although one senses that Rhodes benefited more from this agreement, nonetheless the language suggests a general overall equality between the two. Now a third text, although one senses that Rhodes benefited more from Litos, nonetheless a little bit of this is missing from the beginning. It is apparently a letter sent to the Seleucid king Antiochus II, renewing the agreement of friendship and alliance previously made with Antiochus's father. The little that survives of this text indicates a reciprocal agreement of friendship and alliance between the king and the polis of Litos, even though the king was a much more powerful force in the Greek world than Litos was. Finally, a fourth text presents an agreement between Alaria, a Cretan polis so small that we're not certain exactly where it was located on the north shore of the island, and the medium-sized island of Paros, located due north of Crete. The agreement between these two polis, who may have been regular trading partners, provides an exactly equal reciprocal set of obligations, including isopoliteia, or equal political rights, in the other polis. Now, of these four agreements between a Cretan and a non-Cretan polis or power, three essentially establish exact equality between the two parties, and only the second, between Hierapytna and Rhodes, establishes an overall rough equality, but with variations in detail. All four agreements, however, show that the Cretan polis are independent and equal polis operating autonomously in a world in which many non-Cretan polis were regularly controlled by foreign powers. Thus, the agreement confirms both the independence of Crete and its polis, and the roughly equal status of these polis with the other polis and powers of the Greek world. Now, the most common type of agreement are those between two Cretan polis. Most such agreements also make a clear effort to present the relationship between the two as exactly equal, or nearly so. Two different means are employed to express this equality. Either the details regarding different aspects of the agreement are repeated verbatim, or nearly so, for each polis, or the details are only stated once, but they are clearly meant to apply to both polis equally. Now, consider first the agreement between Lato and Olus. This is handout number 5. Two cities in the eastern part of the island. Much of this text is restored, but we have other texts concerning the same alliance, so that most of the restorations are fairly certain. The text begins, and I quote, "The following matters were agreed by the Latians and the Olantians." Then comes a clause dating the agreement by the common method of naming the eponymous cosmoi in each polis. Then, in lines 3 to 4, the first clause of the agreement states simply, "to remain a friend and ally to each other, sincerely and honestly, for all time, and to have the same friend and enemy." This pledge of friendship and alliance is common in Cretan agreements and is usually made, as here, by both polis. Lato and Olus thus make this pledge on equal terms, and the text concisely affirms the equal obligations of both polis. Now, the next set of provisions, in lines 4 to 10, however, spell out the details of each polis's commitment separately, even though these are almost exactly the same. "And if someone invades the land of the Latians, or annexes any of the land of the Latians, or seizes forts or islands or harbors of the Latians, the Olantians will come to the assistance of the Latians without excuse and with all their might, to the extent possible, fighting from their land. In the same way, also, if someone invades the land of the Olantians, or annexes land of the Olantians, or seizes forts or islands of the Olantians, or harbors, the Latians will come to the assistance of the Olantians without excuse and with all their might, to the extent possible, fighting from their land." This is the same full repetition of details we saw in the first agreement we looked at between the Oreoi and Magas. And the same fullness continues in the Lato-Olus agreement in lines 10 to 14, where certain rights are spelled out for the Latians in Olus, and then the same rights are spelled out for the Olantians in Lato. I won't read this section out, but as you can see, the repetition again is almost verbatim, and each polis has exactly the same rights. The lengthy repetitions of details in these sections is especially remarkable when one considers the time it would have taken to cut all these letters into the stone a second time. This was not a cut and paste operation. Clearly, it was very important to the cities involved to do the additional work in order to make absolutely clear the equality of the obligations on both sides. Now, after this come two sections in which the details are stated just once, but apply to both polis. 15 to 17, export is allowed for a Latian from Olus and for an Olantian from Lato, by land tax-free, and by sea paying the fees set out by the existing laws in each polis, after swearing that the export is for their own private use. Then the next clause, 17 to 20, reads, "If campaigning as a common force, we should take heloimen, something good from the enemy, each polis can have its share according to the number of men who went on the campaign. And if each polis campaigns from its own land, neither is allowed to conclude a peace treaty or to make peace unless the polis plan this jointly. Here the names of the two cities are not even mentioned. Instead, the author uses a first-person plural verb, heloimen, and pronouns indicating commonality, hekateros, each, and medateros, neither. He could have avoided the repetition of details in the two central sections by referring to one polis and the other polis. For example, if we go back to lines 15 to 17, he could have written, export is allowed for those of one polis from the other polis by land, by tax-free, and by sea, etc. But for some reason he did not want to write it this way, perhaps because he thought it would not be clear to the reader. Now these authorial preferences control the next section, that is 20 to 25, which begins, in each polis the kosmoi, during their term in office, shall administer an oath every year to the agalah, whose members are then finishing. The agalah is the boys' age group in Cretan cities. Here, each obviates the need to name the two polis, but the next clause does name them, with a delegation of Olantians present in Lato and a delegation of Latians in Aulus. The author could easily have written, with a delegation from each polis present in the other, but for some reason he chose not to. Then the next clause in the section specifies that an oath be sworn at a specific local festival, different for each polis, and so there was no way to avoid naming both polis and their festivals. Now, all the provisions of this agreement up to line 50 follow these same general rules in either naming both polis or naming neither. So I will only note one additional factor that is new, namely a vocabulary that implies interaction with another polis. This is lines 38 to 42. There shall be the right of intermarriages with one another, and there shall be an authority for the Latian with an Olantian in Aulus, and an Olantian with an Elatian in Lato, both to sell through the debt registry, and to buy, and to lend, and to borrow, and all other transactions according to the laws in force in each polis. Here, the first clause asserts the right of epigamiae alalois, intermarriages with one another. Since epigamia in itself indicates the right to marry someone of a different polis, epigamiae alalois clearly means a mutual right for people from each polis to marry someone from another. There is no need to add for a Latian with an Olantian and for an Olantian with a Latian. In the sentence that follows, however, since words like sell and buy do not imply a transaction with someone from another polis, there are no words in Greek for what we might term interbuying or interlending. Then the two polis need to be named separately. Even in this case, however, the scribe somewhat awkwardly puts the two polis at the beginning of the sentence, a Latian with an Olantian in Aulus and an Olantian with a Latian in Lato, so that he then only needs to add the details once, both to sell through the debt registry and to buy and to lend and to borrow and all other transactions according to the laws in force in each polis. Now the rest of the text just contains a description of the borders between the two polis, the oaths to be sworn, and the dates for swearing, followed at the end by a brief summary of the entire agreement, which I won't read. Now, the analysis I've given for the reasons for combining details and mentioning both cities or neither city works for many clauses in the other agreements between Cretan cities, though some authors manage to find other ways of presenting some details. But no matter how the rights and obligations of the two cities are expressed, they are always equal and reciprocal, just as in the Lato Olus agreement. Even when the details are written out separately, they are almost entirely the same for both poles, with only minor variations. In this way, Cretan agreements almost always stress the closeness of the two cities involved, as well as their equality. Now, to confirm that this is truly the case, let me briefly consider two more Cretan agreements, beginning with that between Hierapetna and Lato. This is your handout number 6. Here, the proportion of detail presented separately versus combined is about the same as in the Lato Olus agreement. But in some clauses, we find an even more concise expression. As in the Lato Olus agreement, this one begins, in lines 4 to 10, by asserting friendship and alliance with the details combined, but then specifies that aid be sent in case of an invasion, with the details repeated. In fact, in every agreement that survives, if there is a section about sending aid in case of an invasion of the other polis, the details are always given separately for each city. Now, the next two clauses, lines 10 to 11 and 11 to 13, however, combine everything. A Hierapetnian in Lato and a Latian in Hierapetna are allowed to participate in religious and civic affairs if they have been just in their private affairs. And there shall be the right to marry and to own property, secular or sacred, according to their own laws, for the Hierapetnian and the Latian. And continuing on from there, after some fragmentary lines, comes the standard clause about export, 20 to 23, in which all the details about export are combined, as are the details in the following sections. I won't read any of the other clauses of this text, many of which are similar to those of the Lato Olus agreement, but if you go through it, you can see that the details are combined except when there is a difference in detail between the two poles, just as we saw in the Lato Olus agreement. If we compare this text as a whole to the Lato Olus agreement, in some places the Hierapetna Lato agreement goes slightly further to combine details than does the Lato Olus agreement. This may be understood as an effort to emphasize the equality of the two poles even more, or it may simply be that the author of this agreement devised a technique that the earlier author had not been aware of. Now, one more agreement, this is handout number 7, between Hierapetna and its neighbor Priansos, has a section that combines details to an extent we have not seen so far. After the usual dating clauses in 2 to 5, the two cities commit themselves to abide by previous agreements in lines 5 to 12. Then comes a section on rights. This is 12 to 18, which you have up there. For the Hierapetnians and the Priansians, there is to be with one another, par alalois, the right to equal citizenship, to intermarry, and to own land, and for those who belong to a common tribe, the right to participate in all sacred and secular activities, and to buy and sell, and lend and borrow, and the authority to engage in all other transactions in accordance with the established laws in each polis. Now here, placing the phrase par alalois, with one another, at the beginning of the sentence, right after the names of the two poles and the verb amen, there is to be. This allows the author to provide all sorts of details that are understood to be reciprocal, even when those like buying and selling would normally not be understood in this way. This section then sets the stage for combining just about everywhere possible in the rest of the agreement. Next come provisions about planting in 18 to 21, about depositing for import or export, 21 to 27, and about pasturing in 27 to 30. In the first of two of these, the author evidently felt that the activity required that each polis be mentioned. In 18 to 21, a Hierapytnian shall be allowed to plant in Priancian territory and a Priancian in Hierapytnian territory. And in 21 to 27, if a Hierapytnian should deposit anything in Priansos, or a Priancian should deposit anything in Hierapytna. But the next section, 27 to 30, he avoids naming two cities. Quote, in the same way, if someone pastures, he shall pay no tax. But if he does some damage, he shall pay the penalty for doing damage according to the laws in effect in each polis. Even though the meaning is clear here, namely that if someone pastures, it must be understood to mean if someone pastures his flock on the land of the other polis, this is still a fairly extreme ellipsis. But since the author found it acceptable, we may wonder why he did not use a similar expression in the preceding sections, saying, for example, planting will be allowed if the planter pays the same fee, etc., instead of using the names of both cities. Next in the agreement is a provision, lines 30 to 33, in which it would have been impossible to combine the details completely. If there is need of a delegation, the Hierapytnian Cosmoi will provide travel expenses for the Priancians, and the Priancian Cosmoi will provide them for the Hierapytnians. If the author had written simply, if there is need of a delegation, the Cosmoi will provide travel expenses, a reader would probably assume that each Cosmoi, or Cosmos, was supposed to provide expenses for his own polis's delegation. So the expanded wording is clearly necessary in order to make the meaning clear. The existing wording, moreover, clearly emphasizes the reciprocity of the clause in a way that the more condensed wording would not. Now, in the remaining sections of the agreement, the details in most sections are completely combined. For example, in 38 to 40, during the Harayan and during the other festivals, those who go to the other city can go to the Andreon just like the other citizens. In 40 to 43 reads, every year during their Hyperboion, those who are Cosmoi in each city at the time are to read the stele, and they are to announce it in the other city 10 days before they are going to read it. Even with the details combined, the meaning of these clauses is clear, as is the reciprocity of the agreements. Finally, the last section, 77 to 83, presents an interesting dilemma. Like many agreements, it ends with the requirement that each polis set up a stele with the text of the agreement written on it and display it in a public place. Here, both cities are required to set up the stele in the sanctuary of Athena Polias. Evidently, there was a sanctuary of Athena Polias in each city. So the clause mentions each sanctuary separately, even though they have the same name. I suspect that the author was trying to avoid any possible confusion by repeating the name of the sanctuary, rather than by simply saying each city should set up a stele in the sanctuary of Athena Polias. In any case, the Hierapytna Priansos agreement goes the furthest of all surviving agreements in combining details. Now, all the agreements we have examined so far, 4 with a non-Cretan partner and 3 Cretan-Cretan agreements, whether the language of their provisions is highly condensed with most details combined or is spelled out in repetitive detail, they all seem to be written in such a way as to stress to a greater or lesser degree the equality and reciprocity of privileges and obligations of the two parties. Even the agreement between Rhodes and Hierapytna, that was handout number 2, which clearly reveals that Rhodes was the more powerful party and was presumably the driving force behind the agreement. This takes pains to show that the obligations of both parties are roughly equal and reciprocal. Now, in treaties and agreements between cities or powers in other parts of the Greek world, this kind of equality and reciprocity is far less common. The Hellenistic period was marked by the rise and fall of powerful monarchs, with shifting alliances and frequent wars. Agreements between cities and other powers often mark the end of a war or a shift in alliance, and in these one party is often imposing obligations on the other with little or no reciprocity. A fairly typical example of this is handout 8, an agreement of alliance between Rome and Aetolia. The text is provided by Polybius, but scholars agreed that he had access to the archives in Rome, so that the details he provides most likely reproduce the terms of the agreement accurately. I show only a few excerpts. The agreement requires the Aetolians to honor the Roman people, to prohibit others from attacking Rome, to make war on whomever Rome is at war with, to pay Rome a large sum of money, to provide hostages to Rome, and so on. Rome's only obligation seems to be to sign the peace treaty, though even this is not stated explicitly. There are, however, a few Hellenistic agreements that attempt to achieve some equality and reciprocity. One is the decree of Cremonides, by which Athens and Sparta and their allies agree to join Ptolemy II of Egypt in an alliance against Antigonus Gonatas of Macedon. This is handout number 9. Now, the first 69 lines of this decree are preamble, giving the context and reasons for the agreement. The agreement itself occupies lines 70 to 97, or about the last quarter of the whole text. Now, if you look at the Greek text from the beginning of the agreement, lines 70 to 81, you can see that about 3/4 of it is in brackets, indicating restorations. And it is clear that the restorers presume that the original text had a good deal of verbatim repetition of details. And if they are correct, the first 2 provisions repeat the same details verbatim. First 72 to 74, and then 74 to 81. This is just the same as many Cretan agreements do. Now, the next 10 lines give details of an oath that various Athenian officials are to swear, followed by the requirement that various other Spartan officials swear the same oath. The agreement ends with familiar clauses about revision of the agreement in 92 to 95, and its inscription and display in each city, 95 to 97. Now, the equality and reciprocity shown in this agreement is very like what we find in Cretan treaties. But as I have said, this is very unusual outside of Crete. We should also note that the agreement is limited, the only significant requirement being mutual defense. Many Cretan treaties, of course, contain similar requirements of mutual defense, but almost all of these also specify other reciprocal rights and obligations besides mutual defense. Thus, even this agreement falls far short of the full equality and reciprocity of a typical Cretan agreement. In fact, there are no real parallels among the non-Cretan texts to the typical Cretan agreement. Now, the Cretan commitment to creating agreements that are equal and reciprocal becomes even clearer if we examine the few agreements between two Cretan communities, one of which is much more powerful than the other. In each case, the main polis and the dependent community are neighbors, close neighbors. Only 5 such agreements have survived, and 2 of these are very fragmentary. I will look briefly at 2 of those that are not so fragmentary. The first displays the largest degree of equality and reciprocity. This is handout number 10, an agreement between Gortyn and Lapa, a small community to the northwest of Gortyn. Only the first few of its provisions survive, but these are indicative. The initial dating clause, lines 1 to 3, shows that Lapa is an independent polis because it has its own eponymous cosmos. The agreement then begins, lines 3 to 5, with an indication of full reciprocity. The 2 polis agree to have an alliance with one another for all time, sincerely and honestly. The next provision, lines 5 to 7, is not reciprocated. The Lapian will follow the Gortynian both in war and in peace, wherever the Gortynians should ask them, and they will have the same friend and enemy as the Gortynians. But the next 2 provisions, 7 to 10 and 10 to 15, are fully reciprocal. First, Lapa agrees to come to the aid of Gortyn if it is attacked. This is 7 to 10. And then, in the same way, Gortyn agrees to aid Lapa if it is attacked. There are some differences between these last 2, making Gortyn's pledge to aid Lapa somewhat more restricted than Lapa's pledge. But taking the text as a whole, there is a substantial degree of reciprocity and equality in it, despite Gortyn's much larger size and greater power. Now, the other example of an agreement with a dependent community is less concerned with exact reciprocity than with securing commitments from both parties that are different in nature, but overall are roughly equal in importance to the other party. Now, this is an agreement between Gortyn and Kaudas, handout number 11. Kaudas is a small island to the west, just to the west of Gortyn. After a dating clause, the opening provision, lines 4 to 8, details Gortyn's concessions to the Chaldeans. The verb in line 4, epikoreo, is to concede, not the usual verb to agree. This indicates Gortyn's dominance over the Chaldeans. Gortyn concedes freedom and autonomy to those living in Kaudas and specifies that they can use their own laws. However, these concessions also require that the Chaldeans remain in the arrangement that the Gortynians arranged, and that they follow the Gortynians in both war and peace. Now, the rest of what remains of this text obliges Kaudas to contribute a specific amount of produce to Gortyn annually. This is the next provision, lines 8 to 11. The people living in Kaudas are to bring 1/10 of everything that is produced in the land, just as the Gortynians do, except for mortal things and the revenue from harbors and vegetables, let them keep these for themselves. Mortal things here refers almost entirely to animals. This indicates that the Gortinians themselves also contributed 1/10 of their produce to the city, presumably to support the common meals in the Andreon. On the whole, then, this agreement seems good for both parties. Kaudas gets the protection of Gorton while keeping its basic autonomy and participating in the public financing of meals on roughly the same terms as the Gortinians themselves. Certainly this agreement is more balanced than, say, the peace treaty between Rome and Aetolia, in which Rome concedes nothing in exchange for the many obligations it imposes on the Aetolians. Now to conclude, I have tried to show that some of the ways in which the language of the agreements made by Cretan polis in the Hellenistic age promoted the desire of these polis to affirm their place in the larger Greek world as fully independent and on equal terms with the other Hellenistic cities and powers. The agreements between a Cretan polis and a non-Cretan polis or king all contain language that emphasizes the equality of the two polis, even when it is clear that the Cretan polis is considerably less powerful than its non-Cretan counterpart. The agreements between two Cretan polis also emphasize their independence and their equality among the other cities on Crete. But these agreements also strengthen the ties among all Cretan cities. Part of the purpose of these Cretan agreements is military, protection in case of an outside attack. But it was also important, and perhaps more important, to involve the citizens of each polis in the diverse affairs of the other, again on a precisely equal basis. Thus, while maintaining their independent status in the Hellenistic age, the cities of Crete established a comprehensive network of interconnecting privileges and obligations. I only looked at 3 of the Cretan agreements. I could have presented many more that served the same purpose. And even when one of the 2 Cretan cities is clearly dependent on the other, agreements between them record concessions and obligations for both parties. In all this, Crete differs from the rest of the Greek world and from Rome, where few agreements provide even the appearance of equality and reciprocity between the 2 parties, and none provides the range and diversity of reciprocal commitments that we find in the Cretan texts. Thank you.
Bueno, hemos escuchado la conferencia del doctor Gagarin. Muchas gracias. No sé si todavía tenemos unos minutos. Arturo, no sé si se pudieran hacer algunas preguntas o si hay algunos comentarios que me puedas proporcionar. Si hay alguna manera de que alguien intervenga y el doctor Gagarin conteste, no sé, Arturo, porque todavía tenemos algunos minutos. Sí. A ver, si me permiten un segundo. Pues bueno, vamos a dar paso entonces a, si quieren, si tienen algún comentario, si tienen alguna pregunta. Por lo pronto yo, I would like to thank Professor Gagarin for this interesting conference, and in which he shows his lately research, because he also has a book wrote with Paula Perlman in 2016, very recent, called The Loss of Ancient Crete, 650 and 4th century before Christ, edited by Oxford. Well, thank you very much for your for your interesting conference. And I don't know if there's somebody who wants to make a question to Dr. Gagarin, if he is able to answer it. Alguien que quiera intervenir o que quiera pues hacer un comentario, alguna pregunta, me lo pueden indicar. Alejandro Romero.
Pues muchas felicidades y agradecimiento. Thank you very much. Congrats.
¿Alguien más que quiera hacer alguna pregunta o tenga alguna duda? Well, yo solamente quiero expresar que, bueno, estos tratados de paz entre los iguales y entre los desiguales, desgraciadamente se siguen dando en la actualidad. Pero aquí vemos la visión de los imperios y la visión de los pequeños que se consideran iguales. I don't know if you can tell us, Dr. Gagarin, something about some commentary about your conference, or if you want to say something to our Congress.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, very well.
Okay.
And we would like to see if you can open your screen, because I think some of us are emotional. We have very emotional at having you here.
Well,
Yes.
I'm sorry not to be in Mexico City in person, though I understand, of course. One thing I want to say before anything else is there was a little tiny bit at the beginning that got cut out, in which I thank the organizers, and I am very, very grateful. And I particularly wanted to thank Martha Irigoyen for all her help with this.
Yes.
And I could not have done this without her. And so I just wanted to record that. Otherwise, the reason why I have been working with my colleague on Crete so much is that we feel that Crete is a very interesting place during this whole period, and it's quite different from the rest of the Hellenistic world. And not very many people know very much about Crete. So that's why we have been trying to make all of these inscriptions available to people, and we hope to have a second volume. It's been a bit delayed, of course, by COVID, but we hope to have a second volume in maybe 2 years, ready to present all the later evidence. So I thank everybody for listening or tuning in, and I hope that maybe some of you will take a greater interest in the island of Crete and its life and affairs. So,
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. And well, of course, some of us are very interested in your work and your research about ancient Greek law. And we still have some 7 minutes. I don't know if somebody else wants to, si alguien más quiere hacer algún comentario, alguna pregunta. Las personas que están fuera. A ver, David Slick wants to make a question? Yes? Oh, we don't hear you. Your microphone, yes.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the talk. I'm going to have to speak in English. I was interested in the comment that you made, Dr. Gagarin, about the more hypothetical rather than practical nature, that some of the agreements seem like things that wouldn't ever come to pass. And I guess, so my question would be in 2 parts. Have you encountered any evidence where they actually, some of the cities applied the agreements? And if that's so limited, then I'm wondering why are they doing this, right? This seems like a great effort for a hypothetical connection. Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting. I think one can say in general, with all of these agreements, that we very rarely see the military side of it being put into effect. It's not really clear whether they anticipated a good deal of invasion of other people's land. From what we can see, there was really very little of that. So it seems to me, in general, even when the two cities are fairly equal, that these provisions for military aid in case of invasion are more a way of simply asserting a kind of equality and bringing the two cities together rather than for any practical reason. So I think, I don't know exactly, because you think, why would some very powerful ruler like Magas, want to make this kind of an agreement with these little territories? But the little territories are in southwest Crete, probably quite close to the African continent of Cyrene. And so they may have been trading partners, they may have had other relations, and this is a way of simply formalizing that and letting people know that oh, there I am, letting people know that there's that these two have close ties. So I think that's the main reason. It wasn't really, neither of them had in mind that one of these days one of them would be attacked and the other one would come and help.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. Anything else? No, we can't hear you. I can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Yes, I'm sorry. Well, it's a beautiful surprise to meet you, although it's virtually.
Yeah.
But, well, thank you very much for your conference, and for the next Classics conference in Mexico. We hope to have you here, and without sickness and all those things, pandemias and all those things. But it would be great that you could come to Mexico some of these days for the next International Congress of Classical Studies in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank
Muchas
you.
gracias.
I would be happy to. So anyway.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos los que participaron. Pues ahora sí ya tenemos 3 segundos justo para cerrar e irnos al siguiente evento. Muchas gracias por su atención y esperamos que sigan pues atendiendo a las interesantes participaciones de nuestros invitados. Gracias. Adiós. Bye.
See you.